Okay. So before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and the land from which we meet and the lands about which we're going to talk about, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And today we're going to talk about biophysical modeling. So within this collective economics series, I think this is presentation number 4. And this video will stick on the website for people who couldn't attend to be able to follow up and catch up with what's going on. So a quick recap. So the Eco-nomics platform, there's 4 key parts to it. So there's Eco-nomics Plan, which is a lumped subcatchment scale modeling for rapidly generating investment portfolios. Eco-nomics Projects, so for being able to have farm scale modeling for capturing those individual projects. Economics Reports, so be able to communicate and impact report on what you've done. And then ultimately Economics Markets, so being able to provide project level details that can facilitate existing and emerging sort of environmental markets around that. So we're focused on Economics Plan in this round of series, but it does relate a bit to Economics Project. So I'll just make the distinction between those, if that makes sense. So Economics Plan, so subcatchment level, lump modeling, rapid investment portfolio generation. So we want to be able to do fast computation, and it's for investors to come up with investment portfolios and NRM bodies and local government authorities to be able to generate kind of subsets, if you like, of investment strategies. So, and it's primarily based on a previous product that we've built called Reefonomics. And what it does, it generates portfolios based on, we've got about 150 alternate on-ground actions that we can do. And an action is either an agricultural practice improvement or an intervention, like a revegetation activity, plus the associated support mechanism that goes with that. So that collective on-ground work and support we call an action, and those actions then have costs and likely adoption rates and response rates that go along with them. And what's novel about Economics Plan is to be able to deal with multiple values. So it's not just about water quality. It's about being able to capture water quality, biodiversity, First Nations, social, economic, and representation of climate change related consequences of the actions that we do. And so that's a tricky thing, and that's the tricky thing about today's discussion, I guess, is how do you represent a quantitative response to all of those things in a single approach or a consistent approach. We want to be able to explore scenarios, that's fine. We want to be able to have some representation of confidence, and I'll talk about that today as well, about how we represent the underlying confidence in our prediction. So we need that to be able to combine variable quality based data and variable quality understanding of the impacts of actions on that base data. And we also want to be able to represent the temporal response of each of those actions. So to be able to make the distinction between hard engineering, dumping rocks and pouring concrete, and soft engineering, planting trees. They might have the same ultimate water quality improvement outcome in 15 years' time, but the speed at which you achieve that varies, and that's often reflected in the price of doing those actions. And we also have adoption potential captured in here as well, but we won't worry about that today. So by comparison, Economics Project, so this is a farm scale modeling exercise, and the intent here is to be able to capture whatever the most appropriate modeling approach is at that very local scale. And so, for example, what we've done in the reef, you can see our sugarcane, banana, grain and grazing masks represented below. So the areas where we model those and can model those, we represent that. So the Economics Project allows us to step away from the more generalized solution and have very locally specific, using the best available local data to represent that. So firstly, we'll get Economics Plan out the door. So we'll have a beta early next year, and then we'll get rolling into Economics Project, initially working on what we've done in Reef World, but then adding more locally specific projects. So what's common between both economics plan and economics project is effectively we have these actions. We apply those actions, they do work and alter our measures. So the things, and then and the measures might combine up to provide a report on the values, the things we care about. So the process is similar, but what differs in economics plan, the way that the action impacts on the measure is simple and fast. And for economics project, much more complicated, locally relevant, local data, and it's more computationally intensive and slower to run. So we can't run big investment portfolios. We'll just deal with it on a project by project basis. So an example of how this kind of looks, if we've got an action here of cultural burning, then that impacts on one of our measures here might be fine sediment load, and we've got a mechanism of capturing that. And quantitative capturing, we deal with it as efficacy, yield, and fixed change, and I'll talk about these in more detail. And for the qualitative representation, we're using a Likert scale approach, and I'll talk about that as well today. That's probably enough on that page. So we get now to, expand out, still thinking about that action of cultural burning, and then all the measures that we want to be able to capture. The ones I've represented in dark are ones that I think we can represent quantitatively, and the ones in lighter grey, more qualitative, the Likert style approach of representing things. So we'll talk through both the quantitative and the qualitative today and how that might work. So here's our collective list at the moment of what we think the values are. And Paul Webb, you'll notice that I've added productivity in here, and that relates to the sediment loads. We might care about that in terms of in-stream water quality, but we also might care about that in terms of productivity, in terms of a measure of soil loss from the farm. So the same measure, but delivering on two different values. So across those measures, we've got sediment, DIN, salinity, microbial. The microbial stuff comes from our work in with Southeast Queensland Water, who care about loads of protozoa and virus and bacteria delivered to water treatment plants, and so where source water protection can reduce those microbial loads. Biodiversity measures. We've got further meetings coming up talking about that, but I'm proposing here that we don't try and quantify biodiversity, not predicting the number of koalas, but using a surrogate measure of the amount of high quality vegetation that might change through these different actions. First Nations as a value, so being able to represent the direct engagement and on-country values associated with each of the actions. A community engagement to represent the social component, economic component, so this is outside implementing the action. Is there a broader impact of that action on the industry, so the agricultural industry, or on the regional economy? And then from a climate change perspective, we've got, is there a likely carbon sequestration potential from the activity? We increasing ground cover or planting trees. Land resilience index, actually ground cover will be a thing here. So if we're reducing stocking rates to increase ground cover, that'll also give us, will be more resilient farming practice to changing climate. And then methane production index. So some things like, in fact, I've got an example later today. A wastewater treatment plant upgrade will reduce DIN, but that effectively what it does is converts that DIN into methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So we'll have a negative impact through our increased production of methane. Okay, so here's my representation of basically how the call it modeling process works, or what we propose in Eco-nomics Plan. So we start off with what I'm calling the base data. So we have the area available to do the work. So let's think about a grazing management practice change. This is the available area of grazing. And then these orange things are the measures that we might care about for that. It might be soil related activity, for example, or soil loss. So then we've got an action, and that action it gets applied to an area type. So area type here, grazing, and then we've got an impact of that action on the load or condition that we care about. So we're going to have a big impact here on if this is a fine sediment by applying this action. And we might even have a negative impact. So I've got these words upside down to represent that it might go the other way. Okay, so effectively we apply the action and we just do some accounting. So we apply that action over the area. So now there's largely a reduced area to do other work. So because we've used up that, and that's not an exclusive thing. So some actions can occur concurrently on a parcel of land, but it's a property of the action. Principally, we need to keep account of the available area to do work. We apply the change in load by applying the action, to modify this initial load to get an after action load. And that's kind of the basic accounting of how this works. What we also need to be able to represent is confidence, and it's about so that we can create portfolios that combine practices that are well known and the impacts are also well known, and also new and novel activities that we're not necessarily as confident in the likely outcomes of them, but from a decision maker's perspective, they're all going into the pot to come up with an investment portfolio. So our mechanism of being able to include all those things is to be able to provide confidence around our predicted outcomes. And this is what decision makers deal with all the time. So imperfect knowledge. So we're just trying to put some bounds around our collective portfolios of interventions. So we've got confidence around the input data. So this is something that doesn't exist in the reefonomics world because the input data is consistently of a high quality. But when we take this outside the reef area, we're going to have variable quality input data to drive the thing. So we want to be able to represent the confidence with which we've represented the base, the starting conditions. We also want to be able to represent the confidence within which we're predicting a change in that. And we want to combine those things to have an overall confidence in our reported change. So we combine those things through. So we'll talk a bit more about confidence and what we propose to use here. So and there's many ways to talk about this. So people talk about confidence and error and uncertainty. We've intentionally used the vague term confidence. And because there's two basic ways you can be wrong. So you can have epistemic, which is a conceptual model uncertainty. Basically, we assume the system works in a certain way, and that might not be right. So biophysical science, that's pretty good, quite mature. We're pretty confident about how all these mechanisms work. It's kind of based on physics, but you're trying to represent a social response to something. We've got an assumed kind of mechanism, but that might be entirely wrong. And then the other way to be wrong is fundamentally around the data. So we just ultimately don't measure things or can't measure things well enough. So things like data collection error or data insufficiency error, we just don't measure enough of these things, or where we're trying to use models to represent what's going on, there's error associated with that model. So if we've got epistemic and data error, we effectively can't quantify the epistemic error. So there's no point trying to come up with a 95% confidence interval, which we could do around the data, because we don't know what the epistemic error. So we can't quantify epistemic error because we don't know what we don't know. but we can have some indication of the epistemic error by the maturity of the science that supports that. So, for example, biophysical science, we're pretty confident that we've got the processes well nailed. So our approach here is to adopt this heuristic method of confidence that's used in the reef reporting area. So ultimately, you get a score out of that of 1 to 5 around confidence, although in that world it's called data error, but we'll just call it confidence here. We'll convert that to a 0 to 1 because it's easier to deal with in a computational sense. But essentially that method has, well, here's a little screenshot of how it's implemented in Reefonomics. It's a little survey that you answer, and the survey gets answered associated with the base data, but also with the action and the action's impact, assumed impact on the measure in each case. And so for each of the 5 elements, we've got a score about the maturity of the method, how well the method's been validated, how representative that underlying validation is, across the space that you want to apply it to, how direct that process is compared to what you're applying it for here. So often we'll use a surrogate data set or some surrogate inference to apply it here. And then the last element here is about the likely measured error associated with everything above. So ultimately you get a confidence score for the base data, a confidence score for the prediction action, and then we simply combine those things by multiplying them together. So effectively it's not as bad as taking the minimum of the two, but it weights it heavily towards the most limiting confidence element, so to give us our overall confidence. So that's one part of the story today. The next one is about how we quantify the effectiveness of an action. And so dealing with that for the things that we can do quantitatively, and they're our sort of water quality measures, if you like, we represent them by one of 3 ways. So the first one is a fixed change. So think about an example of a wastewater treatment plant upgrade. We're going to have 1,000 tonnes per annum DIN reduction by implementing that. It doesn't apply over an area. It's effectively just a point action with a fixed total load. A yield is a change per unit area. So this is like an agricultural practice change. So it's a reduction per hectare, or riparian work might be a reduction per kilometre, so per linear feature. So this scales out by the area in which you apply it, but you get the same reduction for every hectare that you apply it to. And that's as distinct from the efficacy component, which is a proportional reduction. So this might be, so for filtering type actions. So let's say we have a 20% reduction in our hill slope erosion load by doing riparian vegetation. That hill slope erosion rate or load might be reduced because we're doing a lot of agricultural practice change, and it's reducing, the total load by a fixed amount, but our end filtering is only ever reducing 20% of what it receives. So the idea here is that hopefully when you apply all this, sort of mass balance prevails. So we're not, you're not applying a fixed change to a reducing input, if that makes sense. And this is what we've got represented in Reefonomics, and all the actions that we've captured there. There's about 100 actions this seems to work sufficiently for. And then the additional actions we caught up about last Friday, couldn't come up with any of those actions where this wouldn't work. I'm sure some will emerge along the way, but so that's where we are with quantifying action effectiveness for our quantitative things. And if I lump up all the different action types, if you like, so the first one here, riparian revegetation work, we might have 5 or 6 different actions in that bucket. So fencing and with active revegetation, with passive revegetation, and with off-stream watering, at different combinations of those things. The way that we represent those in Reefonomics and I think in Eco-nomics Plan, we can do similarly. So we're using gully toolbox methods that represent their all efficacy-based approaches, so proportional reduction. Similarly for gully work. For the grains industry, in Reefonomics we use yield, so load reduction per hectare, and that's based on a whole bunch of how leaky modeling runs. We've got how leaky being built as a separate service which needs to ultimately be calibrated for different parts of the country, and we can use that. So we've got locally specific values, but for now we've got a large number of simulations across a lot of different climatic and soil types from the reef. So that'll be our initial surrogate, but with a lower level of confidence, if you like, in the predicted outcome. And similar approach for other horticulture. So everything other than cropping, do a similar thing. For grazing and for streambank related stuff, we're using Thorburn and Wilkinson's work, and this is a little screenshot out of that paper. It's a collation of different projects and data sets that relate a change in hill slope, gully and streambank erosion for ultimately different cover classes. And you get to those different cover classes through revegetation and through grazing practice management change. Rehydration projects, I think from the fine sediment perspective, we can deal with in a similar way, but we'll have to investigate that. For intensive agriculture, so this is working with feedlots. In the Southeast Queensland project, the Catchment Investment Decision Support System, we use an efficacy-based approach for that. And principally in our microbial column, we've got sort of microbial reductions based on different intensive ag type practices. Dealing with terrestrial revegetation, I suspect, or I'm hoping that we can deal with this as a yield based on the difference between yield of one land use type and another land use type. So conservation land use type versus open grazing land use type. So the relative difference between those, to use that as a base representation of the likely sediment savings or nitrogen savings you'll get by revegetation. And then our novel world here is about being able to represent avoided destruction. So what's the benefit of preserving something? And I think it should be really the same process as representing what you'll get by revegetating something. But what we need to do in that case is change the base. So the base has got to change through time. And we've got an upcoming meeting to talk about how we might deal with that business as usual case. So that's a major change from how we traditionally do water quality modeling, where we assume a base case and measure a change from that. If you assume a steady state base case, it means that you would never do avoided destruction. You'd never bother preserving anything that's current because it's assumed to be static. So to be able to move away from that assumed static base case is something we're trying to represent, but not today. Okay, that's all our quantitative stuff. Now we get on to our qualitative world. We want to use a Likert scale approach, and this is a screenshot out of Reefonomics where we've used this, and we've just got a 5-point scale. In Reefonomics, I want to increase that to a 7-point scale to give us a little bit more granularity, if that makes sense. Ultimately, we're getting a score out of this of -1 to 1 for every one of our kind of subdomain elements. we multiply that to get the change. We multiply that Likert score by the area that we implement the action for. So, to get some measure of scale. Now, we can do that for the whole portfolio, and we'll end up with numbers that we can compare between scenarios. So it's useful to look at the relative change, but it's still a bit of a meaningless number. So I propose that we represent that number, convert it to a minus 100 to plus 100%. So stay in that range that's kind of that humans can perceive, and it seems to make sense. So we do that by proportioning that overall Likert score by the available area ultimately. So to give that some context, so we've got an example here where we say, let's say we've got a catchment of 1 million hectares, 100,000 of that is grazing land, so 10% is grazing land. Our action might be dealing with grazing management to improve cover. And we're concerned about the land resilience Likert score. So, and I'm saying here, when you reduce stocking rates for this increased cover, that's going to give us a much improved land resilience value. So that gives us a land resilience score of 0.66 from our -1 to 1 range. Now we're applying this action, let's say we'll apply it to 20% of that 100,000 hectares, so 20,000 hectares. So our change score in this case is 0.2 times 0.66 times 0.1. So it's proportion of the overall catchment, and then by 100 to get us into the percent realm. So by applying grazing land management to 20% of the grazing land in this catchment, which makes up 10% of the catchment, that improves the overall land resilience score for the catchment by 1.3%. And then you combine the land resilience score across all the actions you've done. It's a straight additive action. And in the case where the area that you can do work is conservative, you'll stay within the plus or minus 100%. But because it's allowable, you can do duplicate work on the same land. It's possible, if everything was done everywhere and the Likert scores were a maximum for everything, that we could exceed 100% in that overall improvement. But to me, the risk for that is relatively low compared to the value of being able to operate in a -100 to 100 kind of range. So
what, can I ask a question about this?
you can, or do you want to hold it till the end?
Yeah,
we'll end the recording and then we'll come back. Yep. So these are the areas that we're thinking about representing in this qualitative way. So the First Nations, social, economic, and climate change related measures. Okay, so we'll jump in to a problem with what I just proposed, where we scale it by the area. So point-based actions don't have an area associated with them. So we can either not deal with these qualitative Likert scores for things that are point-based actions. That's option one. Or option two, rather than scale by the size or the area, we scale by the size of the impact of the prediction. So things that have a big impact on the pollution source have a bigger scalar applied to their Likert score. So an example here for a wastewater treatment plant upgrade, the DIN load from urban, let's say, is 10,000 tonnes per annum. The wastewater treatment plant upgrade is going to reduce that load by 1,000 tonnes per year. And we're saying the Likert score for methane production is going to be on the significantly worse range, because we're going to be generating a whole lot more greenhouse gas. So it's going to give us a -1 on the Likert score. So then that methane production change score by implementing this point source activity is going to be -1 times 0.1, because we're dealing with 10% of the available load. So we're scaling by the load. So we're going to have an overall methane production change score of -10% from this action within the portfolio. We'll come back to this, no doubt, but I'll just finish off this round of presentation by thinking about this last point here to deal with this prediction is about being able to capture the temporal response. So, and this is what we have implemented in Eco-nomics, and I propose to do the same here. So we have 4 different response temporal responses, if you like. We've got immediate, so down at the bottom right here, so hard engineering actions, pouring rocks, pouring concrete or dumping rocks, so we get an immediate change. Linear, so we don't really know, but we know it'll change, we don't know the rate. So we just apply a linear change over 15 years, starting from kind of no change in year 0 through to by the time you get to year 15, the total effectiveness that you've defined has been achieved. Slow is about slow initial response and then increasing to get to that 15-year point. So this is things like a revegetation, which might take several years for the vegetation to become established, and then it starts to become quite effective. And fast action, so things that initially respond fast and then the rate of improvement slows over time. So something like a decreased stocking rate might have a rapid initial reduction, and then it'll take a while for the natural systems to stabilize, if that makes sense. So pasture grasses to come back and re-establish themselves. Okay, so that's where we are. So we got through to this biophysical modeling discussion. Coming up, we've got biodiversity quantification. We're going to talk a bit about the biophysical data for this Southern Queensland landscapes implementation. That'll be on Friday, and then more on the biodiversity data. And then coming up is that business as usual discussion. And that's kind of rounds out the collective modeling components, if you like. So I'll put this video on the economics.net.au/videos site for others. And that summarizes the presentation.